Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Growth Culture, a New Approach to School Improvement. We appreciate your taking the time to participate in this webinar, and we also appreciate the sponsor of today's webinar, Pivot Learning. Before we begin, I'd like to review just a few quick housekeeping items. We welcome your questions and encourage you to send them in at any time. We'll answer as many questions as we can during a Q&A period at the end. To send a question, use the questions feature in your control panel. You'll just type your question into the top box and click send. I'll receive your question and I'll put it into the queue to be answered at the end. We do have a lot of content to cover today, so we will likely not have a whole lot of time for Q&A at the end, but we do plan to share all of the questions and answers to those questions following the webinar on a web page or in a document. So if you have a question, even though we may not be able to answer it live, please do go ahead and send it in and we will get back to you with that answer. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please use that same questions feature to get my attention and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. The number one technical problem you may run into is just a lag in the audio, and that usually has to do with your internet bandwidth and the strength of that connection. So if you have that issue, you can disconnect from the computer audio and call in via phone. That information is on your control panel as well. You can stay connected to the slide decks through your computer, but you may get better audio through a phone connection. So sometimes going old school is the better route for technology, but hopefully no one has problems. If you do, shout out through the questions feature and I'll do my best to help you. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar with you as well as the slide deck. And as I've mentioned, we'll provide written responses to the questions we received during the webinar, so you can reference those as well. Just keep an eye on your email tomorrow for details on how to access those materials. Now let's get started. I'm very pleased to welcome all of our panelists. We'll start the program today with Robert Curtis, who is Vice President, Education Programs for Pivot Learning. Prior to joining Pivot, Robert was the Director of Regional Support and Assistant Director of Teaching and Learning for ConnectEd, the California Center for College and Career. Robert has extensive experience working nationally with schools, districts, post-secondary, and workforce leaders, building local capacity to transform educational systems and improve student outcomes. He's also former Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Sonoma Valley Unified School District. Robert is joined today by Andy Fleming, who is co-founder and CEO of the Developmental Edge, formerly Way to Grow, Inc., LLC. The Developmental Edge is a unique organizational development firm that accelerates employee, team, and company growth by helping clients to develop the mindsets and processes necessary to ensure that everyone witnesses, supports, and at times even provokes the best in their fellow employees. With more than 30 years of corporate and consulting experience with companies such as Procter & Gamble, Aetna, and Emory University Center for Ethics, Andy's work generates real, measurable, inspirational change. And we're excited to hear about that, specifically with Monterey Peninsula Unified School District. Andy is also co-author of the book An Everyone Culture, Becoming a Deliberately Developmental Organization, and also the creator of many assessments, processes, and systems, including the Growth Culture Indicator, which we're going to learn more about today. And finally, but definitely not least, we're very excited to have Joe Ashby with us today. Joe has been principal at Monte Vista Elementary School in Monterey Peninsula Unified School District in California since 2015. Under his leadership, staff, student, and parent culture, and the academic performance and rigor at the school have all grown stronger. Joe started his teaching career in Cambodia and then taught upper elementary grades for 3 years in the Irvine public school system. He went on to teach in schools in Alabama and Tennessee before moving with his family back to California. During his time in the South, Joe completed a great deal of graduate work, including earning an educational doctorate in leadership, policy, and organizations at Vanderbilt University, Peabody College in April of 2014. So I am very much looking forward to hearing from all of our panelists. And as I said, we have a lot of content to get through today. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the program over to Robert to get us started.
Great, thanks, Emily, and thanks again, Joe and Andy, for joining us today. So a little bit about Pivot Learning. Pivot's a nonprofit organization based in Oakland, California, whose mission is to partner with educators to design and implement solutions to the greatest challenges in achieving educational justice. Pivot works with about 120 districts in 17 states right now. For today, next slide, our framing questions for today's webinar, I'll just wait for it to catch up. Next slide, Emily. Oh, all right, no, I'm sorry. The framing question.
It's actually on there, Robert. Is it caught up on your end?
I got it. Yep. So, what is
Okay.
culture and development organizations? Another question is why measure culture, and how can culture support continuous improvement in schools? And we'll be digging into that today, and you'll hear some examples from both Andy and Joe later in the broadcast. Next slide. So a little bit about me. I'm going to share a little bit of a story about how I started. I started out at two schools. My first two schools that I worked at coming out of graduate school in Boston had two very different cultures. When I came out of graduate school and got my master's degree, I was actually recruited by a school in Irvington, California, on the East Bay, by an inspiring principal. He sold me that he had a school and he was trying to redesign the school to make sure that every student got what they needed to be successful. He was out there recruiting teachers from a number of universities and colleges, and he did this regularly every year. This is obviously a different time when we're looking at teacher recruitment. As a principal, he was humble and vulnerable as a leader, and he admitted he didn't have answers to all the questions, and he really relied on his staff to really help him think through how to really transform the school. And each year he was focused on a few things, and he had us focused on a few things. And what he did is he made sure that we had the resources to make sure that we could do the work that we needed to do, and he really empowered and expected individuals to lead. When I was at Irvington High School, my first year there, I was put onto one of many teams and committees, one that was focused on developing grade level benchmarks. I worked with my colleagues to develop a year-long benchmark project that all students in ninth grade would take that included service learning. The following year, we worked on a no Ds and no Fs policy to make sure that all students had opportunities to really master the content and get the support that they needed. Further down the road, we started having design studios where we actually invited other schools to come and see the work we were doing. And this included inviting parents and students from our community to come in and see presentations of learning by our students. And this is back in the mid 90s, in 1997, 98. At this school, everyone was expected to be growing and helping others to grow. We had ongoing staff professional development almost weekly. And I would say almost half the staff was regularly helping to lead these professional development and plan the professional development. Everyone was expected to be part of people development and helping others to be growing. We also had practices at this school that I still remember to this day. One of the practices during staff developments, the principal or anyone could actually give out Viking pins with a small pin that people would get for recognition for areas where they'd gone above and beyond and done extra. There was also regular time for appreciations and reflections built into the staff meetings, as well as our department meetings or team meetings. We had processes for continuously looking at data and measuring our success and using cycles of inquiry back in the late 90s when this was a major reform strategy. After being at Irvington for several years, I ended up changing schools and went to another school who had some similar grants and resources and was trying to do some restructuring, very similar to what Irvington had been doing. They had an inspired principal. They'd received a number of large grants to help restructure their school, and they were trying to replicate a lot of what had been done at Irvington. But it was missing something, and they weren't very successful at making any of these changes after 4 or 5 years. And when the grants ended, most of these changes went away. Irvington, however, 20 years later, I looked back on their website and talked to some of my colleagues who are still there, are still doing much of the work that they began, and they're continuing to innovate and push forward. And when I look back at my time at Irvington and think about what was different there, I look and I think about the systemic practices that they had that nurture community, personal and professional growth. The practices were owned by everyone. They were job embedded and recurred regularly. Let's go to the next slide, Emily. So a significant difference between the two schools, I think, was the culture. And part of it was the leadership and how we actually support each other. And you can see on one side here is the traditional model where you have a principal or one or a few people who are responsible for developing others. And then on the right-hand side is a model that shows a growth culture where everyone's responsible for supporting the development of each other, and that things go both above and across and horizontal. In places I work today is the schools that have or developing these strong cultures that have the most significant impact on both the adults and students. Pivot's commitment to growth culture as an organization was one of the reasons why I joined the organization, and we continue to embed these practices in our staff meetings as well as our work in the field. As one of my former colleagues used to say, if we want amazing learning environments for students, we need to also provide these kind of environments for the adults and the systems. I focus on growth culture. Focus on growth culture is one way to do that. I'm excited to be able to have you hear from both Andy and Joe about the work that they've been doing, both with Pivot and in their own setting. So I'm going to turn this over to Andy Fleming from the Developmental Edge. So let's go to the next slide, please, Emily. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, one more slide here. Some of the research relating to adult cultures, strong adult cultures focused on growth have been linked to improved morale and climate, increased teacher retention, a stronger sense of community, higher level of trust, improved ability to give and receive feedback, improved perceptions of workplace and career, and gains in student achievement, particularly in reading and math. So at this point, I'll transition and turn this over to Andy Fleming. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Robert. Good to hear your stories of the two settings. And what I want to do is I want to actually just dive right into something here. We're going to give folks the opportunity to do a little sample from the growth culture indicator, and I'll say more about the survey tool as we get into it. But there's going to be 6 questions coming up that are actually going to be linked to some different categories. And let's just dive right in. I'll also say, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with everybody who's on this webinar and to have a chance to share some of the things that we've learned and some of the things that we've been working with both business organizations, with educational organizations, nonprofits, et cetera. I hope there's something in this content and presentation today that is nourishing for each of you. So let's go ahead and go to the actual survey. Going to put you to work. Going to ask you to reflect a little bit on your own organization, your own school, or an organization that you're part of. So can we go to the next slide? All right. So here's a question for you. In your organization, to what extent are the mistakes people make treated as opportunities to learn? And so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and click on from a very little extent or to very large extent or somewhere in between. So to what extent are the mistakes people make treated as opportunities to learn? And here we're focused on the adults. So if you're in a school, it's to what extent are mistakes that adults make treated as opportunities to learn? Okay, we're going to look at results from this a little bit later on in the presentation here. Let's go to the next question. Okay. So to what extent do people challenge each other's thinking in order to help each other improve? So to what extent do teachers, administrators, or just the people in your organization challenge each other's thinking in order to help each other improve? Okay, let's go to the next question. And to what extent do people reveal to others areas in which they might be struggling? To what extent do people reveal to others areas in which they might be struggling? So from very little extent to very large extent. Okay. All right, next question. And to what extent do your organization's leaders acknowledge what they may have contributed to problems? To what extent do your organization's leaders acknowledge what they may have contributed to problems? All right, coming up on the 5th of 6 questions here. So let's go to the next one. After a project ends, to what extent does each team member receive feedback about the way she or he approached the project? So after a project ends, to what extent does each team member on that project receive some feedback about the way she or he approach the project. And we're not looking here for to what extent do we say, well, what worked well, what didn't work well on the project. It's does each team member receive feedback? All right, let's go to the next one. Last question, and I'll make sense of this chart at the end here. But to what extent are there clear processes in your organization for everyone, including non-managers, to participate in improving the way work gets done? So it should say to participate in improving the way work gets done. So to what extent are there clear processes for everyone, including non-managers, to participate in improving the way work gets done? All right. So we're going to go ahead and tally up the responses we've got and share those back with you toward the end of my part of the presentation here. But let's go ahead and advance the slides a little bit here.
Yep, let me just get through those poll questions, and I think
Right.
we're where you want to be.
Perfect, perfect. So here's where I want to start, just as a way to frame up what we're talking about. So I can say, starting today, starting right this moment, some people and organizations are going to get a little better. They'll get a little bit better with some experience, a little bit of learning. So you can see the line sort of goes up gradually. They'll get a little bit better starting today. Let's go to the next one. But a few people and organizations are actually going to get better at getting better. They're going to improve the way they improve. And that's going to put them on that orange curve that over time is actually going to accelerate upward faster and faster compared to the black curve. Okay, so the question is, what are they doing differently? What is it that lands an organization or a person on the orange curve instead of the black curve? And by the way, in most organizations that we've spoken with and worked with around this kind of material, they'll say, well, I'm not really sure which curve I'm on, or I'm not really sure which curve our organization is on. If they're asking the question, then we actually know which curve they're on, because you don't get on the orange curve by accident. You have to be deliberate about getting on the orange curve. So let's go ahead and look at what are they doing differently to be on the orange curve. The research that we did for our book that Robert mentioned earlier, the book's called An Everyone Culture, Becoming a Deliberately Developmental Organization. What we found is that the organizations that get on the orange curve, in their everyday culture, that's what accelerates the development of people and the capabilities they need to drive the organization forward and upward. So it's not just sending people to workshops. It's not individual coaching, those kinds of things. Those kinds of things can be helpful, and they have a place in the ecology of developing people and organizations. But what we saw, the organizations that really had it going on were the ones where the everyday culture, and you can now imagine that some of the questions that we were asking earlier are all about the everyday culture. So these are organizations that aren't just a great place to work every day, they're a great place to grow every day. And it's for everyone every day. Okay, let's go to the next one. In these organizations, they have the kind of orientation that development is actually a team sport. That I come to work every day, and part of my job is to help other people develop and grow and get better, and part of their job is to help me get better and grow. So we come to the next slide here, the same picture that Robert showed earlier. We call such a culture a growth culture, and we call organizations that have a growth culture, we call them deliberately developmental organizations, and where development's a team sport. And the feedback, the coaching, the encouragement goes up, down across the whole organization. And there's systems and practices that are baked into the everyday culture that support that. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We found in our research that in broad strokes, there were three big dimensions we called edge, home, and groove that made up a growth culture. So let's go to the next one. I'll blow this up just a little bit here. So edge is really the challenge side of development. And that's to what extent does each person and each team and the organization itself, to what extent are they operating on a kind of developmental edge? Are they being stretched in some way? On the home side, that's, consultants have to come up with their own language for stuff. So we're talking about the support side. So we're talking about challenge and support in organizations, challenge and support for each person, for each team. And so home is, to what extent do people have kind of a crew or an ecology of communities that they're a part of that both support them, encourage them, and also hold them accountable for becoming more of who they can become, for challenging themselves, for moving further into their own potential. So challenge and support. And, I'm speaking with a bunch of educators, I know that that's not a concept that's unfamiliar to you as sort of the magic elixir for accelerating folks' growth, as a blend of challenge and support. But in the deliberately developmental organizations, what puts the deliberate into deliberately developmental is to have some regular habits and practices that are grooved or baked into the culture that support higher levels of edge and home. And the questions that we were looking at earlier, that we'll come back to in just a second, are questions that relate to that kind of culture. They're a sample from the growth culture indicator. All right, let's go to the next slide. There's subdimensions for each of those categories. And what we found is that the ones in orange here are the ones that are particularly both challenging and pivotal for organizations. So it's to what extent do mistakes actually, are they treated as learning opportunities? The Your Growing Edge is, to what extent do we have that kind of networked orientation where you and I are helping each other grow? On the home side, openness, to what extent do people acknowledge where they might be struggling, share more vulnerably about what they're trying to work on themselves. And the leader vulnerability we've seen is that do the organization leaders themselves, are they into their own development, and are they modeling that for the rest of the organization? So if you'll recall the question, the item that had to do with leaders acknowledging what they may have contributed to problems. On the groove side, is there regular feedback? Are there mechanisms for feedback happening up, down, across? And just, are there regular practices that are in place to support people's development? So, all right, let's go to the next slide here. So the growth culture indicator that you took some questions from looks at, so how developmentally rich is the culture now? What are the biggest gaps between where you are and where you'd like to be, and the highest leverage opportunities for improvement? If all has gone well, we're going to be able to look at some of the actually some sample data, I think, on the next slide here. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, some sample reports from real organizations, and then we'll look at the data that you all generated. So from real organizations, let's go ahead to the next slide, just to give you a sense of this. This looks overall for an organization at Edge, Home, and Groove. The blue, when we do the survey, we ask each question twice. What's the current reality and what's the desired future? So the blue represents current reality, the orange represents desired future. And you can see in this particular sample organization that we worked with, as there are in just about every organization, pretty good gap between the current reality, desired future, and edge and home. And you can see Groove is the lowest score, and it's the lowest score in every organization that we've studied and worked with, because this idea of baking development into the everyday culture is a different paradigm. It's a different way of thinking about how do we grow people and grow the organization. So let's go ahead and look at the next. We do data cuts, and so this just looks at scale of 1 to 5. The blue dot represents current reality. The orange dot represents desired future. This happens to look at a gender cut, female versus male. And in this particular organization, you can see that the women are having a very different experience. They're experiencing the culture not nearly as having as much of a growth culture as the men are experiencing. This happens to be a business organization that's a unit of a global high technology organization that for whom this is a critical issue that they're wrestling with right now. And this highlighted this dimension here. Let's look at the next slide. We can also look at how for tenure, 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 plus, we see that in this particular organization, the longer people stay, the less they experience it as a growth culture. And that for this organization and many others that look like this has enormous implications for staff retention. So if people, I feel like I'm growing, I'm learning in the first part of my career, but later in my career, I don't feel like I'm growing much anymore. What we found is that the extent to which particularly younger generations feel like they're still learning and growing is a key dimension of retention and a sense of engagement and purpose in one's work. Okay, next slide. Joe, you're gonna have the opportunity to hear from Joe because we did this survey. This is actually a report that came from the survey that we did for Monterey Peninsula School District. So we did all of the schools, including all of the elementary, all the middle schools, all the high schools, and all the district offices. And this particular slide represents all of the elementary schools in the first survey that we did at Monterey Peninsula. And it was 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning. I was looking at hundreds of slides because there's scores of schools and district offices, and we did all sorts of data cuts. And I'm looking at this slide and I'm going, oh my goodness, look at this. There's an outlier. And I went on the web. I was able we knew who it was. It turned out it was Monte Vista Elementary, otherwise known as the Blue Jays. And I looked on their website. Their mascot is the Blue Jays. Their principal is Joe Ashby. And I saw this letter that Joe Ashby had written to parents at the beginning of his 3rd year at the school. And I saw Joe writing to parents saying that for the first 2 years, we've been focused on building a stronger nest for our Blue Jays. And I can tell you that my colleagues and I, as we were looking at that language, going, my goodness, this is a brilliant way to talk about home in an elementary school for the Blue Jays. So focus on building a stronger nest so that as we asked our Blue Jays to fly higher, which would be an edge, put them on a developmental edge, we know they've got a safe place to come home to. And that we've also been focusing on practices, that's the groove side, for our teachers that help them enable higher levels of support and challenge for our students. And so, brilliant. And you can see, and Jill will talk more about it, but you can see the scores for Monte Vista are correspondingly high given this orientation and given the practices that Joe will tell you about. Let's go ahead and see if we can see some data here. So going to invite you as we're looking at the data from your all scores, just to be thinking about, so what strikes you about the scores, any themes or patterns that you might see? You can even sort of project how might other stakeholders rate your school or organization and any implications you might say. So this is going to be our composite scores, obviously not the score from your school, but you could play this little imaginative game, if you will. So let's go ahead and see what we've got here. So on the, all right. So yeah, could we go back to the slide just before this?
Yeah, Google Slides is a little finicky, so sorry about that.
Okay. So what's interesting here is that the percentages here are the percentage of folks who rated this item a 4 or a 5 in your organization. So you can see actually not too many people rated it a 4 or a 5 for any of the questions. The highest one is mistakes, viewing mistakes as learning opportunities. That's one of the edge questions here. Challenging each other's thinking is also another edge type question here. But then you zoom over to the home side, and the very lowest one was 8% in terms of folks revealing to others areas in which they might be struggling. So think about that. If you're a teacher, to what extent if folks are struggling in the classroom or in some part of their professional life, but not talking to each other about it, kind of doing it silently, that doesn't lead to that kind of networked sort of growth culture picture that we're talking about. Leaders acknowledging what they may have contributed to problems is one of the higher items, interestingly, on this survey of you folks. Not nearly as high as you might like it to be. And then in terms of groove overall, yeah, these are the lowest items as we typically see. 9%, 13%, just this idea of baking development into the everyday culture as a new sort of concept. So let's go ahead and just rifle through the other slides real quick. So you can see, yeah, actually mistakes people make treat as opportunities to learn. The highest, second highest item, 3 was the highest for quite a number of people, very little extent. So you're not going to get a growth culture. You're not going to get on that orange curve we talked about earlier if this is the orientation. Next one. Okay, most people in the middle, yeah, but not sort of middle to low. Okay, next one. Do people reveal to others areas in which they might be struggling? Yeah, nearly half the people rated it a 1 in this, and very low on the right-hand side of the continuum. This, to me, this is striking to me, and this is sad to me, that in organizations that people are sort of suffering silently. Okay, next. All right, leaders contributing to problems. Yeah, over 40% actually rated this a 1. This doesn't surprise me. This is typically a showstopper in terms of what we see as far as feedback, that organizational leaders sort of take the orientation that, no, it's you people who need to develop. I'm okay. The best organizations, the one with a growth culture, the leader or people in leadership roles are fully engaged themselves. Okay, next one. One of the groove ones, yes, 62% people not getting feedback after a project ends. Next one. Go ahead and clear processes for everyone to contribute. 43% said nope. Okay. Yeah, so we got a sense of this. Let me give you a sense of where the Blue Jays scored on this, and we're gonna switch back and forth here. And we're gonna hear more from Joe in just a second here. So Blue Jay scores for some of these challenging each other's thinking was one of the ones, and you can see the Blue Jays were up in the 4+ category. Mistakes seen as opportunities to learn, really high scores for the Blue Jays. Processes for everyone to participate in improving the way work's done, real high scores. Joe's going to be talking about that, these kinds of things in just a minute. So last thought I want to leave you with, a set of thoughts I want to leave you with. Let's go to the next. So why measure culture? You've probably heard, go ahead. That the idea of culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, it doesn't just eat strategy. Let's go ahead. Culture also eats reform. So go ahead. It also eats new initiatives. Go ahead. Also eats goals. Go ahead. It also eats good intentions for breakfast. If the culture, and it can eat good people for breakfast as well, or it can feed them. And a growth culture actually feeds and nourishes people. Go ahead, next slide. And so why measure culture? Also, funders are going to start caring. This idea that culture is so important can tell you that in the business world, this idea has taken currency. So philanthropy and other funders who have any kind of a business background more and more are going to be looking at, gee, if we're going to put money into a system, into our schools to improve, to make change, to do new initiatives, we want to put money where the culture, there's a growth culture, so that people are actually going to be able to make the changes. The changes will actually come through the other side, as Robert talked about in the one example that he met. All right, I'm going to stop there. I appreciate your engagement and attention on this. Turn it back over to Robert, who I think is going to set up Joe.
Hey, thanks so much, Andy. So 2 years ago, as Andy described, we started a project with some funding from the Silver Giving Foundation to partner with the Monterey Peninsula School District to do a pilot of what would it look like if we focused on developing a growth culture across a district. And you can see some demographic data and some of their scores there to give you some basis for the Monterey School District. Next slide. So we partnered, next slide, making sure So we partnered with the school district, and the superintendent, PK Diffenbaugh, believed that to transform Monterey Peninsula School District into a high-functioning, high-performing district, he wanted to build a deliberately developmental organization using growth culture. So next slide. So Pivot partnered with Monterey, and we performed the qualitative assessment of district culture using the GCI, as Andy just described, and you got to see some of those results. We shared those results back, and then we began working with cross-functional teams to focus on mission-critical equity challenges that kind of were related to those areas of challenge that came out of the survey data. They identified both personal and organizational goals for improvement in these teams, and then they designed tests, implement, and iterate each month. And then at the end of the we did this for about a little over 12 months. They completed a post-pilot survey using the GCI again to look at how they grew according to the survey results. So next slide. So again, I said we actually asked for volunteer teams. We ended up with a 5-team cohort from 4 elementary schools, 1 middle school, and 3 elementary schools, 1 middle school, and then 1 district department volunteered, which was the human resource department. So this is the group that we worked with on a monthly basis. And then based on the survey data, these teams focused on areas that they wanted to work on to improve that were also related to goals that they had for either their school or department. So next slide. And I won't go too much into this. Andy's talked about the survey, but we did administer the survey to 1,100 employees, and 785 people responded to the survey. So when you look at this data, that's what the survey data is based on. Next slide. And here are some of the results. So across all the domains, the district employees aspired for more growth and challenge, trust and support, and structures and systems, similar to what Andy shared previously. This was the pre-survey data from across the district. Next slide. And at the end, 4 of the 5 cohort sites showed significant improvements. So you can see the 4 sites there, and the only one that didn't was Los Arboles Middle School, and they had a transition in leadership. We also had other results that show they did grow in certain areas. So next slide. And then each of the sites focused on some particular areas related to home, edge, and groove. And we're actually able to look at the differences then in growth in those particular focus areas that the different sites chose to focus on. And all of this is actually available on our website. We did a paper that you can look at if you want to see more about the work and the results. Next slide. In particular, I mentioned earlier, the Human Resource Department was one of the groups from the district that took part. They actually saw a 61% improvement. When we looked at the pre-survey for the district departments, the HR department was not an outlier in the pre-survey, but as you can see in the post-survey, similar to Blue Jays, they really were an outlier at the end of the work. Next slide. All right, at this point, I just want to introduce Joe Ashby, who has been a great partner, and really appreciate having him here today. And he'll share more about what this looked like for his site and some of what they engaged in through the pilot project. So thanks, Joe. I think Joe's muted still.
You should be good to go, Joe. Joe, are you with us? Well, it looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, so let's see if we can troubleshoot that and get Joe back with us.
Hello?
Hi, yep, you're here.
Sorry about that. My sound wasn't working for a minute on my new computer.
No worries. We've got you
Okay,
now.
great. Let me turn up my volume now that I got the thing connected better. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound good.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so with when I came to Monte Vista about, let's see here, this is about 4.5 years ago, I came to a school site that it was reopened after the military had rented it out for a while, and so in 4 years' time, it had 3 different principals. And so when I came into the scene, it's kind of in a need of resuscitation for a lot of reasons, culture-wise, professional development-wise. And so I interviewed all the teachers that summer before I started. And I did a lot of kind of like research-driven pieces when I surveyed them. I gave them all the same questions, and then I took all their answers and developed, themes and patterns and cross-connecting pieces, and then in really strategic ways presented the data from those interviews to the whole staff. And they really wanted an instructional leader, and they wanted professional development because they weren't having any. They wanted staff meetings where they can be all on the same page. They wanted to improve culture. So I came to a staff that was largely a seasoned staff, and they wanted to have a leader to come help bring the school to what they thought it could be. So that already was grounds for growth culture type of work, because they were all wanting to work with me and knew my background based on what was told to them about my background, and knew that I was here for a long haul to help them become the school that they knew that this school could be. So that was a nice place to be. Now, what happened, so before growth culture, there was some things that we had put into the water for a couple years before we actually did that initial pilot survey. So, I was already developing distributed leadership teams with two-way lines for feedback and decision making. So I had like a PBIS team, an instructional team. I had a school site council with teachers on that. Also, I already mentioned the interviews and surveys that were really helpful a moment ago. And then also we developed a school vision together, and we, in very just strong and explicit ways, connected it to all of our work and our PDs, and we really actually reestablished PLCs and what PLCs could look like. And I implemented right away an instructional rounds routine that gave them feedback on a Google Share Doc individually, and my coach, we started actual coaching cycles with different teachers. So all that was put into the water, and we had to do that in very small moves, but within a couple of years, a lot of those things were up and running and going strong. And also we amped up a lot of our PBIS culture stuff as well. In a very distributed, everyone had a voice in that process. So by the time we took that survey for growth culture as just a pilot survey for the whole district, and those results came back, it in a way validated that first 2 years. And so in that that pre-pilot survey, it had shown that some of the pluses that we noticed were that, the organization, that we did value, I valued the growth of the teachers and the classified staff as well, and encouraged people to work on personal improvement. I was constantly communicating appreciation in all sorts of ways and positive contributions, and teachers were doing that of one another too, on their grade level teams and across as well. And then also I showed a commitment to that they recognized that I really honored and wanted to help foster their personal development and provide challenges, but with equitable and relative support as well. So there's nothing I ever expect of my teachers that I don't support them with, and build in structures to support them with. So some deltas though from that survey that were really helpful were that, we didn't still have a lot of ways where teachers were able to talk about what they wanted to improve on. At that point, we only had just their own personal Google Doc from instruction rounds. We had the teacher evaluation system, which I had to revamp a lot of, and initially, and also they just have a lot of opportunities, structural opportunities to really talk about their development. Sometimes because they wanted to please me so much, and they knew how hard I was working, a lot of times they didn't always take risks to say things or to question things at times. and question what another's thinking, especially across the seasoned teacher to the new teacher or the newer teacher. And then finally, even though I was, very self-reflective myself and put myself to high expectations, they still didn't feel always comfortable. I didn't come across as always being like someone that was inviting them to give feedback to. So for my own self-improvement and my contribution to just different issues. So that needed to be worked on. So when we heard about the opportunity to become, when they, a year, let's see here. We took that survey in August, heard all the, about how the results were in December, but by, I think it was by February, March, later that school year, I heard about this pilot and we had to apply for it. And I said, well, we had really good results on this survey and I liked the deltas that we needed to work on. So why not take an opportunity? My instructional leadership team agreed because they saw the data. We had this conversation. So we applied for the pilot and got accepted with a couple other schools, another elementary school, a middle school, and the HR department. And became part of this pilot in April. We had a series of meetings at the district level. And what a great journey that was, because it really helped take that data and actually do actionable things with it. And so part of that is we had to develop our norms as we embarked upon this, and we're taking it back. We get a chunk at the district office in these pilot meetings, and then we take it back and chew on it with our staff and our leadership teams in different ways. And one of the first steps was developing actual growth culture norms based on our data. And so the norms that we had developed as a growth culture team that we brought back to our school was that vulnerability is a strength, collaboration, openness over competition and protection, feedbacks are care and investment in each other's potential. And we're stewards of each other's potential, growing everyone in their evolving role, and then our practices reflect what we value. We brought these norms back to our staff in a beginning of the year kickoff because we had the April-May piece, and then we really jump-started it at our beginning of the year school year kickoff, which was a year ago, August. And it was powerful comeback PD for our staff as we presented these norms, and we actually lived these norms in a lot of the growth culture hacks and activities that we were doing. And since then in different meetings and actions from there forward. So going on to the next slide here. So some of the ways, like, what did it look like, right? So one way that growth culture really, transformed how we worked together as a staff was that we had this concept of a constant, like a triple track agenda, the dance floor versus the balcony. So everything I'm telling you, my growth culture team experienced with the pilot teams in our district meetings with Allison Rowland, who was the main facilitator for this. And so this idea of the triple track agenda is that everything we were doing with our staff, and like we did the district, but everything we were doing our staff when we brought it back to our staff was this idea that we were doing practices in these meetings that were developing you as a person or a human being, that were also developing your practices and mindset for your profession back in your classroom. And then we're also taking back to our students, like how can we bring this to a student level application? Because ultimately that's the goal, to bring this to a student level of empowerment and engagement. But adults have to experience it first, like a seedbed, and then grow it with the students after they've experienced it themselves. So the next slide, another protocol we did was called Chalk Talk. And this is, we did this a couple of times with some of our PDs, especially PD around when we were, for the first time, we'd already had small group instruction with reading developed very, robustly with guided reading, but we were starting to, take this Eureka math curriculum that was so dense and build it into more small group instruction structures and formats. And so, but we had a lot of pushback because teachers were just concerned, like, how do we break this down from whole group and then take it to small group and try to do it in differentiated ways? So it was a lot of pushback. So Chalk Talk was really helpful for that, which is where we had these posters with different postulates. These questions that you see here on the screen. One example, what are some assumptions that you have about implementing small group instruction math? Very intellectually provocative question that was touching at some temperature points with some teachers that we just knew from people communicating with each other informally and formally. And so we took these questions on posters, and people put comments on these posters, and then we're circling and annotating and connecting to each other's comments as they rotated from poster to poster, which then set us up for a really amazing Socratic seminar afterwards, because sometimes people aren't really open to opening up in a Socratic seminar right away. So the Chalk Talk helped ready the ground for that Socratic seminar where everyone can have a voice and develop some thoughts. Another protocol we use that I won't talk about much now, but it's called a multiple perspectives conflict protocol, which was a protocol where we got to see different perspectives on an issue and viewpoints and around equity among staff and also among students. So that protocol was very powerful in a couple instances. It was very powerful when we did it as a district level too. I remember the protocol when we used it at the district pilot was around the amount of different voices in the room for our pilot meetings. And so there was some hotspots between like looking at the teacher perspective about principal voice in those meetings and having an equal amount of voice in those meetings. It was great, and it really inspired us as we took that protocol back to our staff. I think I'm ready for the next slide here. So let's see here. During the pilot, some other practices that we put in, you saw some like protocols, right? But then some actual practices that were like manifestations of our growth culture work was the peer instructional rounds. Before it was just my coach and I doing the peer instructional rounds bi-monthly basis or bi-weekly, every 2 weeks. But we started bringing it to teachers doing it in each other's classrooms. And that was also sensitive for different reasons. We had to set that up very gingerly and thoughtfully. Also, we did more small group rotation PDs where we're all together in one room. We maybe started in the same room, but then we broke up into small groups based on interest and needs. And we brought in a lot of growth culture hacks, such as, fishbowl, Socratic seminar, really vulnerable icebreakers to get it going, triple track agenda moments that I talked about earlier, brain breaks that built like community risk-taking connections of purpose moments, and also the ball pit, where ball pit was kind of where you do a circular thing with a question that everyone answers. It's a vulnerable question, and that kind of really just opens up the room to be vulnerable. Let's see here. The last piece on there, I also had more invitations for teachers to give me feedback at several instances through my different teams and individually. And then also we had a lot of individual teacher goal setting and grade level goal setting happening around actual data we were looking at from students and our performance data and developing collective responsibility. So going on to the next slide, thank you. So as we then looked at we took a survey, we had the growth culture from like April and May, and then last school year we were going from August to December. So I think in end of November, we took a post survey of our growth culture experience with the staff. The staff took the survey, and so I'm going to just show you some quick data on where we grew and where we still needed growth. So in each area, so in Edge, we had a delta edge where we didn't grow it. We went down slightly in this organization. To what extent are people encouraged to identify ways to improve how work gets done? So that's something I still needed to work on. I wasn't giving enough opportunities for that. But where we grew in Edge was, to what extent do you feel that people in this organization, other than your manager, are invested in your development? So no longer was it just me that was apparently becoming invested in their development, but other staff members were invested in each other's development through the different structures and things we were doing in our PDs. And that went up a great deal. It went from 3.6 all the way to 4.3. And even our desired state went up 0.3 as well. And that was one of our team's pilot goals, to go up in that area. So that was very validating. The next area where we showed growth in Groove, actually I'll start with the Delta Groove. In meetings in this organization, to what extent is time set aside to share feedback about people's self-improvement efforts? So even though people are open to talking about their self-improvement efforts with one another and more transparent about it, they felt there was still not enough structured time I was giving them to actually deliberately talk about those efforts. So that was a good signal to me, because the desired state went up, but the current state was still down. But where we grew in Groove was just in this piece on about how many of your team's meetings does at least one person mention his or her efforts at self-improvement. Just like I mentioned, people were definitely talking about it more transparently. And so that went up from a 3.3 all the way to 4.3. And then our desired state went up 0.7, which is just astronomical when it comes to when I think about my staff and how they've grown. So, it was the goal of our team for people to be more open about their needs and areas for improvement. And this showed that they just want more structured ways to do it. And then the last area from the survey was in home. And on your team, to what extent are you willing to say things might be risky to say? There's a lot of teachers that are still, especially since I still have a group of, I have seasoned teachers, but I have some newer teachers and some middle of the road teachers. And there's just a group of teachers that still feel like they can't be risky sometimes in saying same things for different reasons. And so this is a good message of how can we create a culture by which people can always take risks to say things that they want to share. And then the alpha, the growth in home, was in this organization, to what extent do leaders respond in an open-minded way to critical feedback? Remember how earlier they were saying like they didn't know if I could take feedback, and for several reasons, like my feelings, for example. But here, clearly, we went from a 3.6 to 4.0, which is one of my pilot goals, that they felt like I was giving more opportunities for them to give me feedback and that I was open-minded in receiving it. Next slide here. Okay, so since the pilot, some things that we're kind of putting into place, and that it continues to live through us, is that our instructional leadership team now is doing the instructional rounds, which they help then develop a problem of practice, where before we were just kind of deciding it on a PD. Well, here they actually were, the instructional leadership team was actually coming up with the problem practice based on the data they were seeing. And then our peer instructional rounds helped, the staff took that problem practice, the ILT design, and then they fleshed it out in terms of a problem practice and a theory of action. And then we took their strengths and needs document, where they need to grow and where they feel they're strong in, and we matched them together to do peer instructional rounds cross grade levels based on their strengths and needs and based on the problem of practice. And that was, we just finished our next round of that, and it was awesome. And then our PLC work now is more designed around the data cycle of continuous improvement, which helps them to actually identify stages in the cycle and how their work that day relates to the cycle and which parts of it. And then finally, I just have even more correspondence that's just more intentional. So our weekly online Blue Jay Staff Weekly, where we celebrate different video clips and classroom happenings. Thank you for that. On this particular weekly, we celebrated in the process of the ILT doing the instructional rounds with pictures of what they did. And then also people responded to their feedback on their individual Google Doc feedback. And so I posted some of their reflections with their permission anonymously as well. And then I always have, sometimes I'm giving them updates on where we are with curriculum and pieces. So a lot of great pieces there in terms of communication and showing how we're being vulnerable and intentional in our practices on the same page. Okay. See here, and just the future at Monte Vista, I still want to bring growth culture to a student level, and we're doing it in many ways. We've adopted restorative justice pieces these last year or so. We adopted Acting Right, which is a great drama-inspired management system of collective responsibility. We also have we're definitely developing more student-centered classrooms and building many different outlets like Soul Patrol for the playground, and where students are leading these pieces. Student Council, they just created a dance and led it for the whole school last Friday. So just really working on that. And also we need more communication with the other growth culture pilot schools and connecting with each other more often about how things are still playing out at their school sites. And last piece is that we're trying to just make our growth culture work really a common thread among all of our initiatives, so that they're not competing with one another, but that it's actually enhancing and connecting those initiatives in a very cohesive, thematic way. And so right now we are revisioning our school right now through elevating our vision and developing a school model for next year. And we're using a lot of growth culture techniques to do that with all stakeholders involved. Let's see, last slide here. Oh, okay, that's back to Robert then.
Thanks, Joe. No, we're at 2 o'clock. So just really quickly, I just want to acknowledge and again, thank Joe and Andy for being on today. But I also want to acknowledge PK Diffenbaugh, the superintendent from Monterey Peninsula School District, and Beth Wadecki and the whole MPUSD staff. I also want to acknowledge Lisa Leahy and Deborah Helsing from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who's provided a lot of insight, inspiration, and expertise for the project, and in particular, Allison Rowland, who was the coach who helped design the facilitation of the pilot project, and Andy Fleming and Claire from Developmental Edge. And a special thanks to Laura Flaxman, who led the project, and Cynthia Rosario, who supported research and design. So next slide really quick. And there's some sources and references. You'll get these. If you're interested to learn more, you can go to the website and download our paper on growth culture and the pilot work we did in Monterey. And please, next slide. And please, any questions? We'll take questions that came up. If you have questions, please actually, maybe I'll turn this over to you, Emily, to kind of close us out on how to do the
Yeah,
questions.
we did have some questions that came in, and as I mentioned when we kicked off, we will compile these and we'll get answers back to everyone to read, and we'll send those along with the recording and the slide deck tomorrow. So we do appreciate everyone joining, especially a big thank you again to Joe and Robert and Andy for providing all of this information. It was a lot to go through in the 60 minutes, and I am sorry we don't have time for questions, but as I said, we'll get back to you with answers to those. And you're also free to reach out to Robert directly with any of your questions, or if you'd like more information about the pilot study with Monterey Peninsula, or if you'd like to learn more about Pivot's role in facilitating that growth culture work within the district. They are available to answer questions about that and also work with your school or district to start building this growth culture that Joe has shared so much about and that you got a taste of through the survey with Andy. So thanks everyone for joining us. Again, a reminder that you'll get a link to the recording, to the Q&A, and to the slide deck in your inbox tomorrow afternoon. We'll also post it to the Pivot Learning website, which is pivotlearning.org. You can head out there tomorrow to find that information, as well as the white paper that Robert mentioned, and we'll include a link to that in the follow-up email as well. And then one final thing, as you log off, you will be prompted to take a very short feedback survey. As we've learned today, feedback is important, and we would appreciate you just taking a second or two to answer the 5 questions that will be posed to you when you log off. And there is an opportunity for you to provide suggestions for additional webinars that you'd be interested in hearing about, and we'll take that into consideration as we plan our 2020 webinar program. Thanks again, Joe, Andy, and Robert. Thanks to Pivot for sponsoring this today, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon.